when we are in an environment where we're simply asked to express our politics through an affiliation, we suggest that what we're asking for is a greater voice than what we actually see as choices in November. And that's at the root of why electoral reform is so important and how ranked choice voting can unlock democracy in the state of Florida and across the country.
All right. So tonight for you, we have the former member of the U.S. House from Florida and executive chairman of the Serve America movement, David Jolly.
Hey, thank you, everyone. I apologize, John. I think I was having similar bandwidth issues to you, so I apologize. But I was also watching the video at the entry point. It's fantastic. So congrats on on the educational video. So listen, thank you for joining us for this conversation this evening. What I would share with you is the work of electoral reform is fundamental to both defending and restoring our democracy. Democracy protection, democracy defense takes on a lot of different themes these days. We know it, we feel it, we understand the challenges to it. But fundamentally, what electoral reform would restore is the ability for voters to ultimately control the outcome of elections. And there's no greater defense of democracy than that. And that's where ranked choice voting comes in. So for those of us in Florida, I presume most of us are dialing in from Florida. What I would also suggest is there's a certain heartbeat of support for electoral reform. We know in the last cycle that more than 50% of Floridians supported open primaries. It fell short of the statutory requirement of 60%, but a majority supported it. And we also know when it comes to ranked choice voting, you have communities like Sarasota and Clearwater and others who are asking for fundamental electoral reform, in this case, in the lane of ranked choice voting. And that is where I think I heard one of the questions early on before I got disconnected, the question about Tallahassee, Ron DeSantis, and frankly, the current legislature implementing legislation to prohibit ranked choice voting. I think we should talk about that. I know this organization has been very responsible and careful about how they ultimately ensure the long-term adoption of ranked choice voting and electoral reform in Florida. And the reality is we have a governor and a legislature that does not support these fundamental electoral reforms. And so that is something we should address both in this conversation, but with our political activism. I'd like to kind of baseline something for us. In addition to the affirmation we saw with nearly 60% of Florida supporting open primaries, there's another very important baseline statistic in Florida that suggests that voters' franchise, frankly, is being restricted. And it's this. When we register to vote as Floridians, we are presented with choices in equity. We determine what designation of our affiliation best reflects our politics. Are we a Democrat? Are we a Republican? Are we an independent? Are we a Green? Are we a Libertarian? Whatever it might be. But those are all choices in equity when it's just a matter of our own registration. When we get to the actual ballot box, we don't see the same choices in equity. We only see two votes, two options viably, which are Republicans and Democrats. And so we perform as a 50-50 state. And that is not a reflection of where our politics sit as a state. It's a reflection of the fundamental failures of our electoral system. Because if on the first Tuesday in November, we were presented with multiple choices in equity, statistics would suggest that we would self-select as we do when we register to vote. And I realize it's a bit of a nuanced example, but it's a very important one. Because understand, when we are in an environment where we're simply asked to express our politics through an affiliation, we suggest that what we're asking for is a greater voice than what we actually see as choices in November. And that's at the root of why electoral reform is so important and how ranked choice voting can unlock democracy in the state of Florida and across the country. picture a world in which we all get to the first Tuesday in November and we're actually excited to express our preference among multiple candidates. And those candidates have to compete for our expression of support. Maybe it's the first slot, maybe it's the second, maybe it's the third, whatever it might be. We are learning the lessons as an electorate about how this might work. We have seen it in other communities. We saw it most notably in Manhattan, but we're about to see it in Alaska as well in November. And so I would suggest that is the reason that we keep fighting. Even if the sitting governor and the legislature has put hurdles in front of us to adopting ranked choice voting, what we know is that it works. What we know is that it empowers more voices. What we know is that it empowers the voices of voters over the voices of candidates and politicians. And there's probably no greater struggle in the defense of democracy than that, because I think all of us would agree that whatever the results of an election might be, whatever the results of a community, their expression might be, provided that fundamentally those results reflect where the community is, that's an embrace of democracy. But that's not what we currently have in the state of Florida, and it's why the work that's being done is so important. So I would suggest as we continue to fight the fight, we do have to overturn now a statute in the state of Florida. That's a major lift. But I would suggest that in the spirit of how this organization continues to confront this issue, rather than demonizing those who have tried to restrict our ability to implement this, perhaps the greater argument is to convince them that if you as a sitting politician or a candidate are so true in reflecting the broad consensus of your community, then perhaps you should be a champion of ranked choice voting, because it ultimately empowers you, protects you, and elevates you to a greater voice within our legislature, not a lesser one. Because the voice that our legislators currently have is actually muted in many ways because it cannot reflect their entire community. It can only reflect the system that produced their election. And that is a vastly constricted community that has elevated them. So I realize that's a bit much by way of introduction, but please know that it's intended to be an affirmation of the good work of this organization, an affirmation of ranked choice voting, an affirmation of fundamental electoral reform, and why, if we are to ever see a fundamental change in how our politics are exercised, it requires advancements like ranked choice voting in the state of Florida. So thank you very much. And in terms of run a show, I'll Carrie or John, I'll give it back to you for how we do any Q&A or discussion from here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. That was really poignant. And I love how you touched on both equity and like representation, like when we go to register, and how many of us in Florida are not part of the duopoly. And so we do want to talk about ranked choice voting, but we also want you to tell us a little bit about the SAM party and why you think it's time for another party like that in America.
Yeah, so thank you. And electoral reform and new party politics are like the closest brethren in this movement. You really can't have one without the other. And let me start with a mistake that's often made in new party politics. So the Serve America movement is, as an organization, is fundamentally committed to creating an additional party in the United States. But we make two mistakes, honestly, in this environment. One is we start by demonizing the two major parties. I would suggest that the two major parties have become a well-deserved home for dogma and ideology. And that's okay. We often criticize that, but the reality is if your politics are informed and your passion is informed by a certain hardened ideology, that's okay. You probably have a home in one of the two major parties. But I think there's a lot of people for whom their politics are not informed foremost by ideology. It's just foremost by wanting to see a government that works and works for the most number of people. In many ways, what ranked choice voting is trying to do. How do we have a government that speaks for the most number of people? And that, I think, unlocks the second key to the lessons of the new party movement. And it's this: new parties, when they emerge, minor parties when they emerge, often emerge based on an ideological dogma, right? If you use the Libertarians and the Green Party as examples, those are competitive minor parties that, they have a place in American politics. But understand they were formed around the same principles that the two major parties were organized around, which is ideology. And and so within the independent space, right, those in Florida, the 35 to 40% who say I'm a no party affiliate, they're not, that 40% is not looking to be told they have to subscribe to an ideology. What they're looking for is an organization that says, we celebrate your ideology, whatever that ideology is. If you're progressive, conservative, moderate, or frankly, like me, I joke I'm in favor of an assault weapons ban, but also lower corporate taxes. My own politics are left, right, and middle. They're all over the place. But there's not a party or a coalition that actually embraces my own political diversity, ideological diversity. So at the Serve America movement, that is the path we are following. We actually think it's the fundamental founding of our country was around pluralism, and that the politics today in Texas around guns or healthcare, immigration might be different than the politics in Connecticut, and that's okay. How do we create a coalition that elevates shared values over shared ideology, that celebrates pluralism, celebrates fundamental difference of opinion, but brings together people committed to a government that gives the greatest voice to the greatest number of people? That is the theme of the electoral reform movement, the ranked choice voting movement, the open primary movement, the gerrymandering reform movement. It it has not been the theme of the new party movement, but Sam is trying to introduce that as a theme of the new party movement, that we can actually embrace a wide coalition of diverse ideologies and build a coalition of people with shared values over shared ideology. It's for me, someone who was always wary of the new party space. I am a convert and will be for life. I absolutely love a space that celebrates ideological diversity.
Absolutely. As a MPA myself, I can definitely relate. Just looking for that home, right?
Right,
But
right.
so that kind of leads into, with so many politicians right now currently trying to enact voter reforms to benefit and favor their party, how do we as activists let other people know like RCV is not like that? It's different. Like, how can we like share that message?
Well, so listen, I really mean this. Look at the open primary ballot initiative in Florida. A majority of Floridians said, we want to enact electoral reform. Now, by statute, we require 60% of the voters to do that. And it is hard work. But I think that the heartbeat of Florida is there. And we've seen it in other states across the country. And so, where by statute, the Florida legislature has limited ranked choice voting or prohibited it, that does not mean that we can't build a movement big enough to enact through ballot petition changes that reflect ranked choice voting in the state of Florida. I think we can do that. I guess my most important lesson learned in this is what it took to get fair districts passed. Now, understand, I'm a I'm an odd advocate for fair districts because it's what ultimately kicked me out of Congress was the adoption of fair districts. But what happened is it took 6 or 8 years, and the League of Women Voters was very active in securing the financing and the signatures and the volunteers and the grassroots and the grass tops to actually create and implement a movement in the state of Florida that said, we want districts, congressional and legislative districts, to be defined by geography, not by partisan makeup. It, in my opinion, was an imperfect solution to a big problem, but they got it done. Floridians got it done. We all got it done. And that's where I think the opportunity for ranked choice voting lies in the state of Florida. Our politics are there. We just have to overcome some of the structural hurdles that incumbent politicians have put into place to protect themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So this one's a little bit compound. Do you think RCV is more beneficial in primaries, general elections, or both? And if RCV were used for congressional races, how do you feel it would help the gridlock that currently exists in Congress?
Yeah, so I think it should be used across the board in primaries and general elections, because what it ultimately does is it elevates the candidate with the greatest consensus. And you can look at the New York primary as an example. The administration of the election had some failure points, but honestly, RCV really worked. I mean, those who complain that RCV didn't work in Manhattan are really tethered to the major party establishments or very strict ideological establishments. What we know it produced was somebody that ultimately had the greatest consensus, and it's a fascinating thing to study. On its impact in Congress, here's where I would say, let's start with the end goal in mind. The end goal in mind is to change the behavior of the Congress, because right now the incentive structure rewards hyperpartisanship. And we will never change the behavior of the Congress if we don't change the reward structure. So if you take the gerrymandering conversation, for instance, rather than geography as a fairness test, I would like to see electoral competitiveness as a fairness test. If we actually created as many 50-50 districts in the state of Florida as we could, imagine what that political environment would look like. You would have incumbents every 2 years running for their political life by trying to prove themselves accountable to voters as opposed to just accountable to their party. It would be a fundamental change in their behavior in Congress. And so that's where I think ranked choice voting, if implemented, could have a real change in congressional behavior. It would incentivize behaviors around consensus as opposed to behaviors around partisanship. And if we have incentives that reward those who act on behalf of the largest number of voters, frankly, we've gotten it pretty right at that point. And notions of term limits and other arbitrary restrictions fall to the wayside, because ultimately what we're trying to do is create greater accountability between voters and incumbents. And I think ranked choice voting is certainly a powerful way to do that.
And do you think, with your experience in Congress, would RCV have improved your ability to govern, or how would it have affected you when you were in there?
Yeah, so um, let's talk a little philosophical and then talk raw numbers and stats. On the philosophical piece, I spent about 20 years as a staffer and then had the opportunity to serve as a member of Congress. I was in one of maybe 15 districts. It was a true 50-50. It elected President Obama twice, but elected a Republican member of Congress. I think every district should look like that. The philosophical piece is this: every member of Congress, whether they realize it or not, and I would say most don't realize it, they make a decision pretty early on whether they are going to try to represent their entire community or just the people that voted for them. And the problem with the way the system is set up is it rewards those that decide the latter. It actually rewards the people who say, I'm just going to represent my partisan voters because that's my surest way to reelection. And it punishes the people who say, you know what, I might be a Republican, but my job is to represent the entire Pinellas County community. And I'm going to try to do that. Because what it does is it throws you into a system with which there's little support, with which the electoral platforms don't align with that type of consensus building. And so if you had ranked choice voting, all of a sudden I get rewarded for trying to represent, in my case, when I was a Republican, not just Republican ardent voters, but also soft Republicans, independents, persuadable Dems. Now I have available to me a universe of voters that I didn't have available to me before. And it lets members of Congress decide, you know what, I may have been elected on a party line vote, but I'm going to go ahead and try to give voice to my entire community, because I think a system with ranked choice voting will reward that type of behavior in Congress. I personally believe it would, and it's why I'm a strong supporter of RCV.
Absolutely. So looking in the chat, there was is Florida a lost cause in your eyes with gerrymandering and the ban and the electoral reform that DeSantis just caused? I just saw that and that just tickled me. What's your opinion? Are we a lost cause down here, or we need to keep trucking?
Here's how I know it's a lost cause. It's a lost cause if we stop fighting. I mean that. It's not just political speak. If we give up the fight, then the fight's over. We lost. This is the only room in which this fight happens and starts and grows. And for baseball fans on the call, I used to talk about serving in Congress with a baseball analogy, that I woke up every day and it was like spring training and my team could make it to the World Series. By the time I went to bed, it was August and I was 20 games back, right? But you got to wake up the next day believing we can change this, because if we don't, we won't, and we lose. And that's why I guess in my earlier comments, I leaned so heavily on the fact that the open primaries initiative got 57% of the vote. Our politics are there as a state. They are. They absolutely are. When we talk binary analysis, Republicans versus Democrats, and people say, oh, Florida's finally a red state, it only is by the scoreboard, because we have binary elections in which 51% dictates everything. If you really break down where our Florida politics are, they remain a third, a third, a third. And so I think there's an environment in Florida in which we can cultivate support for RCV, and we should not give up. I will not be a part of us giving up, because we lose and they win.
I agree. Well, we're not giving up either, and that's why we're still here and doing this stuff. And so my last question, and then I'll kind of add it to one that was in the chat, is what can we do, ordinary citizens, to create RCV pressure on elected officials? And then also, what can a Florida SAM affiliate, this was in the chat, like, is SAM doing anything in Florida? Is there anything that they could get involved in with?
So I would say that for RCV, the traditional organizing of reminding elected officials that what we're trying to do is empower the voice of voters. And they shouldn't be afraid of that. If their politics are in line with their community, they should not be afraid of us empowering the voices within their communities. And then the traditional organizing of op-ed writing, of fundraising, of messaging, of one voter reaching another voter reaching another. And I do think in this current landscape, we might have to get as ambitious of trying to pursue a constitutional amendment. But along the way, because that can be a 2, 4, 6, 8, 10-year initiative, we do have to also try to change hearts and minds of our legislators. Where SAM comes in is this: we are champions of electoral reform. We will help organize and lend our institutional resources to electoral reform. We do also believe that one tool to compete with the two major parties and to change politics in Florida would be with the emergence of a viable third party. There are other minor parties in Florida. We at SAM have spoken with many of them, and it may be we ultimately end up trying to thread together a coalition of minor parties to create a major party. One very interesting thing about how the laws in Florida work: you could file a new party tomorrow. Essentially just three signatures and some bylaws could get us a party, but it comes with no benefits to ballot access, campaign finance, and so forth. We actually would have to have almost 800,000 people register for that party. That takes significant resources to build that coalition. So much like the electoral reform space, it's a long game, but it's a game in which we are committed to playing, because without it, we resign over defeat to the current duopoly.
Great. Thank you so much. I know I'm trying to be cognizant of time, but we did have one more in the chat, if you're okay with that. And it said, what is your view of the Fair Representation Act, multi-member districts for Congress with RCV?
Yeah, so fascinating topic. I was actually just in a conversation about this today, and I would suggest for those who like to read up on kind of the political science approach, there's an author by the name of Lee Drutman who wrote The Two-Party Doom Loop. He's one of the leading political scientists in the reform space, and he has identified as the number one fix multi-member districts. If you take Congress, that would mean, say, taking it from 435 members to, I believe he might even propose like 1,200 members. But it may be in the state of Florida, instead of 29 districts, we only have 12, but each one of those sends to Congress multiple members from their district that reflect the share of votes received by those parties. So it may be that a single district actually sends 3 or 4 different members to Congress, but the intent is to ensure, as I was referring to earlier, that all voices in a community are actually represented. And what it does is, instead of trying to insist with almost a moral argument that our elected officials represent all of us, it actually puts into place a structure where all of us actually have a representative. I'm very sympathetic to that. It is an idea that, boy, if we thought selling RCV was hard, selling a 1,200 member of Congress with multi-member districts and multi-member representation, boy, that's a big lift. But I think it's worth starting the conversation, because ultimately it creates the equity that we talked about at the very beginning.
Well, thank you so much. That's all that I have for you, but we will check with John. But I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us tonight. It's been very enlightening and also motivating. So thank you so much. John?
David, I can't thank you enough. That was truly inspirational. I know why you were elected to Congress now. I can tell you, you have my vote. Certainly, and I'll go back to your enthusiasm that we can change this and never give up. Open primaries, 57% support in a campaign that probably wasn't that strongly run. Had that been a little bit better organized, and they also went with a version of open primaries, which was really the top 2 went on to the general. There's probably a better version of that with a top 4 or top 5 advance to the general and use ranked choice voting. And I believe that had that been the proposal, it might have succeeded. So
that's right.
Anyway, but bottom line, David, we're big supporters of Sam and what you're trying to do there. So we will in kind endorse and promote your organization, and we appreciate you supporting and being the advocate that you are for ranked choice. So with that, I'm going to let you go. We are going to conduct our normal business, but thank you so much, David.
Hey, thank you as well. And I'll leave you with one tease. Just pay attention to the new party space over the next, say, 3 months. I think we've got a big announcement coming, and I think this is a community that would appreciate it. So as Rachel Maddow says, watch this space, because we're going to have something here in the next couple of months.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you, David.
All right. Thank you all.
That's exciting. Thank you again, David. Thank you.